So Resident Evil games are full of some insane and crazy monsters that will do whatever it takes to make you their dinner. So you would imagine that after playing through a game that throws some really difficult monsters at you, that the final boss is going to be the most challenging roadblock in your way of beating the game. However, when it comes to the Resident Evil series, sometimes that final boss fight turns out to be the easiest fight of the game, and other times that final boss turns out to be the most frustrating part of the game. So with a series that tends to go back and forth regarding the difficulty of the final boss, I figured now is the time to finally rank every single boss fight in the mainline Resident Evil games, from easiest to hardest. Keep in mind that we're only looking at the mainline games, and that includes the numbered entries, the Revelation games, Code Veronica, and Zero. Plus, we're looking at these boss fights on the hardest difficulty of each game, while also looking at it from a single player experience only. Oh, and no using instant kill rocket launchers. Before that though, if you haven't already, please consider hitting that subscribe button if you're interested in more ranking videos like this one. Also, hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is every single Resident Evil final boss ranked from easiest to hardest. Let's get it. Number 13, Eveline, Resident Evil 7.
You.
Why does everyone hate me?
Goodbye.
It hurts! It hurts! It hurts! Damn you! Damn you all to hell!
Resident Evil 7 may have had some of the most difficult boss fights in the form of Marguerite and Jack Baker, but the fact is that the game dropped the ball for the final confrontation against Eveline. Considering that Eveline had the ability to create hallucinations and is the cause of all the monsters that you face off against in Resident Evil 7, you would think that Eveline's final fight would be pretty massive, yet you're left extremely disappointed throughout the entire encounter with Eveline. The first phase of the fight, if you can call it that, starts off with Ethan walking towards Eveline as she continues to force you back. Once Ethan reaches her though, the second phase starts. This phase closely mimics another final boss fight in the series, Final Stage Birkin. Eveline becomes a giant monster molded face, and as she slowly moves across the room, Ethan must unload his weapons into her until she's defeated. As long as the player continues to fire at Eveline while keeping their distance, this is a simple phase to complete. Then Eveline pulls out one last shitty trump card, Stage 3. Unfortunately, this stage is just as bad as the rest. For this final part, Chris throws down a weapon for Ethan to use. Eveline grabs a hold of Ethan, and once again, Ethan must shoot Eveline until she dies. This concludes the final boss encounter in Resident Evil 7. Despite the huge lead up to this final confrontation, you're left with what appears less as a fight and more of an interactive scene at best. Number 12, Final Stage Birkin, Resident Evil 2, and Resident Evil 2 Remake. Well, I'm sure you guys saw this coming after I brought it up in the last entry, but of course, Final Stage Birkin is the next one up on this list. What's pretty funny about this is if the game just ended with Mr. X or Phase 4 Birkin for each playthrough as final boss, then they would probably rank much higher on this list. Unfortunately though, Birkin had just one last pitiful attack against Leon and Claire. Resident Evil 2 is unique from a lot of the entries on this list as it gives you two halves of the same game with different characters. Now, the original is somewhat different as Scenario A character faces off against Birkin near the end, while Scenario B character faces off against Mr. X. In the remake, it's changed to just Leon versus Mr. X and Claire versus Birkin. Still, regardless of what game you go with here, the true final boss of the entire game is Final Stage Birkin. This takes place on the second run or Scenario B situation where the character will face off against Birkin one last time while on the train. Similar to Eveline, Birkin basically becomes a blob on one side of the train. As this monstrosity moves closer and closer to the player, they must once again unload any sort of weapons they have left against Birkin. The only reason why I rank this encounter slightly higher than Eveline's fight comes down to the limited resources of Resident Evil 2. By the time you reach Eveline, you're usually pretty loaded when it comes to ammo. However, when it comes to Final Stage Birkin, you probably spend most of your resources dealing with Mr. X or Stage 4 Birkin, with the latter taking the most ammo to put down. Because of that, there is a slight possibility that you could have backed yourself into a very difficult position against Final Stage Birkin to the point where you have no ammo to put him down. In that situation, you have to rely on your knife, and that's what could make this fight much more difficult. Still, as long as your aim isn't horrible and you didn't screw up badly prior to this point, it's highly unlikely that you end up in this situation. Plus, I put a poll out on the channel a couple months ago, and it seems like most of you guys agree with me in saying that final stage Birkin is slightly harder than Eveline, so that's that, I guess. Number 11, T002 Tyrant, Resident Evil and Resident Evil Remake. When looking at most people's lists for difficult bosses, for some reason I always seem to see this one crack their top 10. But here's the thing, I don't see him being that difficult in the slightest. Hell, I would argue that he's one of the easiest boss fights in the entire series, which is a big part as to why we find him near the bottom of this list. The T002 Tyrant is the final boss in both the original game and the remake of Resident Evil. In my opinion, the original game is a little more difficult than the remake's version. Regardless, neither are that challenging. You come across T002 twice in both versions of Resident Evil. The first time is in the lab after he takes out Wesker. This version of him is the easier fight as he walks extremely slow. As long as the player keeps their distance, it's fairly simple to take them out. The second fight is definitely more difficult as this time he can move a lot faster and do some lunge attacks that will send the player flying. However, once again, just continue to move around and use your best weapons. Eventually, Brad will toss down a rocket launcher and then you'll be able to finish him once and for all. Yet, it could even get easier for the player. See, the second phase of this fight could be skipped completely. If you manage to let either Barry or Rebecca die and then refuse to rescue Chris or Jill, then you would skip the entire second phase. So between the option of missing the second phase and with the first phase being a walk in the park, we find T002 at the bottom of this list despite it being our first encounter with the iconic Tyrant. Number 10, Alex Wesker, Resident Evil Revelations 2.
I can still destroy you. I have to destroy you.
So while Alex is probably one of the ugliest monsters in Resident Evil, she's not really all that difficult, hence why we find her near the bottom of this list. Depending on the playthrough, Alex could have one or two phases. Phase 1 is the only somewhat difficult phase here. In this phase, Alex just crawls around the entire area as she attacks both Barry and Natalia. Mainly, she uses one of two different attacks. Either she'll take some swipes at you with her arms, or she'll spit poisonous gas at you. But really, neither of these attacks are that difficult to dodge. When she sticks her head out of a vent, just move around before she shoots you with her acid. Then just avoid that dark smoke that appears. As for her normal attacks, she's kind of slow. Like really slow. So if you just keep moving and then shooting at her, then she should be pretty easy to put down. Her weak spot is a little hard to hit and sometimes she'll make a run after Natalia. But as long as you keep firing at her while also paying close attention to her movements, then this should be one of the easier final boss fights. Phase 2 is even easier as it pretty much just involves shooting her with a sniper rifle and then running away. Simple as that. Number 9, Simmons, Haos, and Ustanak, Resident Evil 6.
Back for more.
God, I hope I pronounced that correctly. So Resident Evil 6 is really unique when it comes to the final bosses. That's because technically there are 3 major boss fights for this game. Unlike something like Resident Evil 2 that has 2 campaigns but a final boss fight at the end of the entire game, Resident Evil 6 has 3 campaigns, with each of them having a unique final boss fight. Technically 4, but one of those connects to a boss fight that I just mentioned earlier. So for example, with Leon's campaign you get Simmons, with Chris you get Haos, and with Jake you get Ustanak. So really there are 3 unique final boss fights in the game alone. With that being said, I feel like they are all kind of side by side with each other. Like if I were to rank them individually, they would end up on this list one after each other. So I figured it would just be easier to combine them all. Simmons is probably the most difficult of the 3 as his fight just continues to go on and on and on. While none of his phases are extremely hard, the amount of transformations this guy has is just extremely ridiculous. Haos technically has one major phase, however it does involve a section where Chris and Pierce have to outrun him. This section can be a pain to deal with thanks to the poor camera angles, but ultimately once you get the hang of it, facing Haos isn't too bad. Finally, there's Ustanak, which of the three turns out to be the easiest fight in my opinion. His fight against Jake and Sherry when they team up with Leon and Helena is arguably more difficult than his final phase. This fight takes place over a pool of lava. Just like every boss fight in the series, provide consistent damage while keeping your distance, and it shouldn't be that hard to beat him. Eventually you'll end up in a phase that turns into a Bruce Lee movie, as Jake will rely on a bunch of quick time events to dodge and attack Ustanak until the fight ends, but yeah, that's basically it. Number 8, Osmund Saddler, Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 4 Remake.
You
Renegade! You have forsaken holy body.
For the most part, taking on Saddler in both the remake and the original is extremely similar to each other. If I had to pick one that was more difficult, then I would probably give it slightly to the remake's version due to the flying enemies getting in your way and that you can't always rely on quick time events to dodge every attack. So with that in mind, let's focus primarily on the remake's encounter with him. Just like many final bosses of Resident Evil, Saddler comes in 2 phases. However, it's phase 1 that provides the most difficulty in beating him. After transforming, you'll see that Saddler has grown giant eyeballs all over him. If you know anything about Resident Evil, my friends, then you should know that giant eyeballs usually mean weak spots. As Leon, the player must shoot each weak spot. Only after destroying all the eyeballs on Saddler will he fall and reveal yet another eyeball for you to do some major damage to by stabbing or shooting with powerful bullets. However, Saddler in this first phase proves to be quick on his feet, considering that he can leap long distances and travel across the battlefield in seconds. As I mentioned earlier, there are those flying bug-like enemies attacking you as well, which I highly recommend putting them down first, as they will annoy you a lot more than Saddler will. 2 other things to keep an eye out for when dealing with this phase are his long-range attacks of shooting acid at the player, and to be aware of which area Saddler destroys so you don't find yourself backed up in a corner. Phase 2 I won't talk about too much, as it's pretty much, once again, just unloading your weapons on him. Then you'll have to grab the red rocket launcher and shoot it at him. And that, my friend, will bring it in to Osmund Saddler. Number 7, Queen Leech, Resident Evil 0.
We'll see which one of us is gonna die.
Resident Evil 0 is regarded as one of the most difficult Resident Evil games. With the limited resources and difficult enemies, you'll find that this game can be pretty hard to complete. Even so, the boss fights in this game are some of the easiest of the franchise. Still, there is one boss in this game that poses a threat to the player. Enter the Queen Leech. This final boss comes in 2 phases. Phase 1 is fairly simple. Keep your distance as always, run around the map, fire off grenades and magnum ammo, and you should be good. The only somewhat annoying part with this phase is the fixed camera angles. Because of how the camera is set up for most of the battle area, it's hard to see when and where the Queen Leech shows up. Ultimately though, it's phase 2 that provides the biggest challenge. In this phase, you play as Billy in an attempt to hold off the Queen Leech, while Rebecca focuses on opening the ceiling. Really, this phase poses 2 challenging obstacles for the players. 1, the Queen Leech is massive and can easily push Billy into a corner. In this position, you can find yourself getting stuck and pretty much destroyed by the Queen Leech. The bigger issue though is that if you're not careful, the Queen Leech can find its way to Rebecca instead and kill her. Between trying to protect her while also trying to avoid getting trapped in a corner, this final boss could prove to be a little more troublesome than you may have expected after playing through some of the easiest boss fights of the series in this game. Number 6, Mother Miranda, Resident Evil Village.
I've spent a lifetime creating this moment, and you try to take it away from me. I will take what is due.
So not everybody loves Mother Miranda as a villain or her backstory that connects her to Spencer. However, I feel like we could at least agree that she's still one of the more challenging final bosses in Resident Evil. Mother Miranda is mainly difficult due to the amount of attacks that she has compared to other boss fights on this list. On the ground, she's able to travel long distances and use her wings as weapons to attack Ethan. Sometimes by moving away from her, you can dodge her attacks, but most times it's usually easiest just to block her attacks if you don't think you can get away fast enough. Keep in mind that she attacks quickly, so as soon as she begins, be sure to decide fast as to how you plan on preventing any major damage. Eventually, she'll start flying and attacking that way, which makes it harder to hit her. However, as long as you keep blocking and firing when you're safe, then you should be fine. But as I said, she has other attacks that you'll need to react to quickly. For example, she can summon globs of goo above her. When she does this, you'll need to destroy these globs as soon as possible or you'll suffer the consequences. Add those attacks to stuff like her leaping attack or her attack in the darkness, and you could find yourself in trouble if you're not careful. The most important part in this fight is to keep moving and find the right moments to attack, the right moments to block, and the right moments to run away. Otherwise, especially on the Village of Shadows difficulty, she'll drain your health quickly and you'll find yourself dying. Number 5, Albert Wesker, Resident Evil 5.
I should have killed you years ago. Cress.
Finally, we get the most iconic villain in Resident Evil, Albert Wesker. In Resident Evil 5, you face off against Wesker multiple times. In the Lost in Nightmares DLC, the 2v2 match against Jill and Wesker, and then you get the final fight, which really consists of 3 stages. Stage 1 starts off with using a rocket launcher to deal damage to Wesker. The players must run around the area, shut off lights, and then while one player distracts Wesker, the other must take their shot at him. Since we're only taking a look at these games from the perspective of playing it on single player, this fight becomes slightly more difficult. Although I will say the AI isn't that terrible at this part. Usually it's easiest to just hand your partner the rocket and just try to distract Wesker long enough for her to get a good shot at him. Even if she does miss, thankfully she'll go and reload the rocket herself. The real issue with this method is that your AI partner tends to be slow at helping you do the combo attack that finishes the fight. Still, this part doesn't provide too much trouble. And since phase 2 is just multiple quick time events, you'll have no problem there either. It's really phase 3 that can prove to be really challenging on single player. Here you're battling in the middle of a volcano. After running away and pulling off that boulder smash moment, you'll find yourself facing off against Wesker in a small little area. The issue here is that you need to find a way to get behind him in order to hit his weak spot. Considering that your AI partner runs everywhere that you do, it becomes a little more challenging than you think. Add that to the fact that if you get too close to the edge and Wesker takes a shot at you or your partner, then it could mean instant death. This final boss fight finds itself on the top 5 because of how much more difficult it is to face him when trying to use a helpless AI as your partner, while also trying to get behind him and hit one of his weak spots. Number 4, Nemesis Final Stage, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis.
You want stars? I'll give you stars.
You may or may not have noticed by now, but most of the time I included the remake and the original game in the same spot when dealing with the numbered entries of the series. However, Resident Evil 3 is different. Resident Evil 1, 2, and 4 share roughly the same difficulty level as their remakes, but I feel like Resident Evil 3 stands apart from each other enough to the point that they deserve their own entries on this list. Of the original 3 games, I find the third entry to be the hardest one. And while the puzzles are definitely harder in this entry and the regular enemies are more aggressive in this game, it's really because of Nemesis why this game is so damn hard. Nemesis is, well, he's persistent. Basically, Capcom took Mr. X and put him on steroids to the point where he can now run at us throughout the entire game. And in certain points of the game, you are forced to confront him instead of running away. One such moment is, of course, the final fight with him. After he becomes a blob-like monster and has become stronger after feeding on the body of a Tyrant, Nemesis is now ready to give the player everything he has left. In the area, the player must push 3 batteries to activate the railgun. What's different here is that Nemesis moves around similar to how Stage 4 Dog Birkin moves in Resident Evil 2. He'll jump on platforms around you and then leap towards you, potentially trapping you in a corner or against a wall. On top of that, he sprays acid at the player while also allowing vines on his back to deal damage as you try to run past them. Eventually, once you get the railgun shot into him, Nemesis goes down. Still, between the long-range acid attacks, the leaping attacks that help him get into position to trap you, and the fact that he has attacks that can hit you even from behind are just a few reasons why Final Stage Nemesis makes it to the number 4 spot on this list. Number 3, Alexia Ashford, Resident Evil Code Veronica. Just like what I said about Resident Evil 0, Code Veronica is one of the hardest Resident Evil games. Unlike Resident Evil 0 though, this game features a ton of difficult bosses, from the airplane fight against the Tyrant to the fight on the rooftop against Nosferatu. Each boss fight proves to be a very challenging one, and the final boss fight of the game against Alexia is no different. While technically the player faces her a total of 3 times as Chris, we are only focusing on the final 2 phases as that's the final fight of the game. Alexia starts off attacking Claire, where Chris must immediately shoot Alexia or she'll instantly kill Claire and cause a game over. After which, Alexia will become a massive stationary beast that uses vines, acid, and small insects to attack Chris. This stage isn't as difficult as the next phase, however it can prove to be extremely annoying if the player can't get into a decent enough position to deal damage without constantly being whipped by her vines or attacked by her insects. Phase 2 of this fight is where things take a turn for the worse. Alexia transforms into a flying queen ant-like creature. From here, she's able to fly around and shoot acid at the player, which makes it extremely hard to hit her. Luckily, the linear launcher has officially charged and is now able to be used against Alexia, which is great because one shot will kill Alexia. Unfortunately, unlike every other in-game weapon that's thrown at you during the final phase of the final boss fight, this one isn't as easy to hit your target with. First, the launcher shoots in first person, but what really makes it challenging is Alexia's movements. She'll continue to fly back and forth all over the map as you try to hit her, while all at the same time she's shooting acid at you. All you need is one hit to connect, but funny enough, that's easier said than done. Eventually, hopefully, you'll make contact with the launcher and you'll defeat Alexia once and for all. Still, don't underestimate her. Her first phase will deal a lot of damage if you're unable to get through it quickly, and phase 2 could take a lot longer than you think for a shot to connect with her. Number 2, Nemesis Final Stage, Resident Evil 3 Remake.
Look, just so you know, this is the last fucking time.
Nemesis strikes again. As I said earlier, the final fight against Nemesis is different enough in difficulty to the point where the original and the remake each deserve their own entry. However, it's Resident Evil 3 Remake's version of this final fight that really just pisses players off, especially when we take a look at Inferno mode. Actually, if we compare this final fight of Nemesis from the original game to any other difficulty in the remake, then I would argue that the original is definitely harder. However, it's Inferno mode specifically that pushes this fight into a broken disaster. I guess I should start off with how the fight goes. It's technically in 2 phases, where phase 1 involves fighting Nemesis while also dealing with zombies attacking you. This phase, while difficult, isn't nearly as bad as his final phase. Your job here is to shoot the switches of the device that Nemesis is on, causing him to be electrocuted. However, in phase 2, Nemesis has become a giant blob monster, just like almost every other final boss in a Resident Evil game. And I mean, when I say blob monster, I mean a massive pile of shit. This version of him has attacks that sweeps all over the entire battle area. The only way to dodge these attacks is with Jill's perfect dodge mechanics. And let me tell you, even with that STARS combat manual that you have, you're still going to need to time these dodges perfectly. Your goal is to hit the weak spots on Nemesis. Once all the weak spots are down, Nemesis will briefly be inactive. At this point, you have to use this time to push in batteries. Once all the batteries are in, you'll be able to use the railgun. You have to complete this twice in order to defeat Nemesis. But even though this sounds simple enough, it's not. Those attacks from Nemesis will almost instantly kill you if you are hit, and they probably will kill you if you don't have the coins attached. Plus, if you get too close to him while he's active, then he'll instantly kill you there too. So like I said, perfect dodge is required for this fight, which is exactly why a lot of gamers get really frustrated when dealing with Nemesis on Inferno. Though it's a short fight, not figuring out the timing of your dodges will easily spell game over for you every single time, so good luck. Number 1, Ultimate Abyss, Resident Evil Revelations.
Norman, stop! Morgan isn't here!
It's no use. He's gone over the edge.
The final boss in Revelations catches me off guard, not because Revelations is an easy game, but just that I didn't expect it to be the one with the hardest final boss of a mainline Resident Evil game. Still, when you take the Tyrant and give them some overpowered abilities, then you really shouldn't be too surprised to find him ranked as number 1 on this list. As I mentioned, Ultimate Abyss takes a similar shape as the iconic boss in Resident Evil games, a Tyrant. Only this time he can do much more than just charge at you with his claws. Jack Norman, the man that becomes Ultimate Abyss, has 2 unique abilities that really make him stand out. The first one is the ability to teleport. Like I said, we've seen similar bosses to this one before. Usually they'll charge at the players with their claws. Norman will do the same, however he can also just teleport behind you and begin his attack that way. And when he combines it with his other ability, he becomes a truly terrifying monster to deal with. His second ability allows him to create fake clones of himself. By doing this, he can lead you on and make you think that he's coming after you in one way when in actuality, he's right behind you. When making his attacks against you, the easiest way to stop him is by hitting his weak spot, the heart on his chest. But as always, that's easier said than done. As the fight goes on, eventually he'll start to use his clone ability to throw you off while he begins his attack. For example, he might teleport in a half circle around you with 2 clones alongside him. Right before his attack lands, you have to hit his weak spot. His weak spot only appears briefly and quickly right before his attack lands. This means that you need to hurry up and aim at that weak spot as soon as it appears to stop his attack. If you fail at doing this, then you will receive massive damage, especially on the harder difficulty. Both this fight and the final stage Nemesis on Inferno proved to be some of the most challenging and difficult final boss fights. And ironically, both challenge the players with memorizing the enemy's attacks and nailing the timing of those attacks. For me personally, I've decided to put Ultimate Abyss as the hardest final boss, mainly due to his attacks being a little more unpredictable and harder to dodge, but I can easily see a case for either of these two being the hardest final boss in the series. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think about my list. Do you think Ultimate Abyss is the hardest final boss? Do you think that Eveline is the easiest final boss? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for more ranking videos like this one, especially if you love Resident Evil. But thanks for watching, and as always guys, I'll catch you on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.